Hello everybody, welcome back to a brand new video where the classic Doctor Who reviews continue, where today we are looking at the series Season 13 opener, Terror of the Zygons. So yes, this was, as I say, the first story of Season 13, what was the first and only appearance in the classic series of the Zygons, who we now kind of remember as a fairly kind of familiar villain really, having seen them in both Day of the Doctor in 2013 and the Zygon Invasion/Inversion in 2015. But back then, this was the first story they'd ever appeared in, and I think it's a pretty cracking story, it's fair to say. This is a story set, albeit not filmed, in Scotland, on the sort of moors up in Scotland. The Scottish Highlands is the idea, on focusing in particular, of course, on the Loch Ness monster. We get a not very well realised, seemingly idea behind what the Loch Ness monster could really be. It's a classic Doctor Who thing of solving these sort of mythological ideas, or sort of supposed myths in the world with Doctor Who-y ideas behind it, and it's actually aliens and whatever mechanical or alien creatures there are that they've got behind it. Of course, the Scarazin being the Loch Ness monster in this particular story. And I think it's just a really, really strong story from start to finish. It's very much continues in the very different vibe to the show that we've got since Philip Hinchcliffe took over as head writer of the show. Or sort of not head writer, but head producer, executive producer of the programme from Terence Dicks and Barry Letts. Where bits of Season 12 were very much still kind of in the vibe of what the third Doctor's era had been, I think it's fair to say. Particularly as noticeable with Robots back in the beginning of Season 12, which was essentially a classic unit story, just with Tom Baker as the Doctor instead of John Pertwee. And the scripts for the various other stories of the season had already been pretty much commissioned by the point that Philip Hinchcliffe came on board, meaning there wasn't really too much he could do to put his own stamp on the show in Season 12. But with the fresh start of Season 13, this very much gave him the opportunity to put his stamp on what he felt Doctor Who should be. He felt it should be a show that very much kind of pushed the boundaries on how kind of dark and serious and horror orientated you could make the show, I think is fair to say. Whereas very much with Barry Letts and Terence Dicks, they would like to push the boat out a little bit sometimes, where you think stories like Terror of the Autons, but they always kind of wouldn't go too far with it. Whereas Philip Hinchcliffe almost wanted to push it past the boundary and go absolutely all out with the very much horror-focused stories, which obviously caused problems with Mary Whitehouse over his era as well. In the couple of seasons he probably sort of was executive producing of Season 13 and Season 14 of the programme. And so although this story, Terror of the Zygons, was filmed as part of the Season 12 production block, it was filmed back when they were filming Season 12 after Revenge of the Cybermen of Genesis. I think it was after the Genesis of the Daleks from what I remember. But they decided they were going to hold it back over until the beginning of Season 13 because of the way the TV schedules have been mixed up. So rather than starting Doctor Who at the beginning of every year, they decided they would start Season 13 in September and have it running in the autumn slot through till the following March. And so it meant between the end of Season 12 and the start of Season 13 was only around a 3 or 4 month gap. Can you imagine that, guys? A 3-month gap between Doctor Who seasons, or Doctor Who series. Like, it's now flipping 2 years, but back then, it meant that there just wasn't going to be enough time for them to be able to produce the shows if they didn't hold the first story back to, or the sort of what was going to be the last story of Season 12 back to the beginning of Season 13 with Terror of the Zygons. So that kind of gives you a bit of a production background on this story, but what about the actual story itself? I think that it's one of the strongest stories in a while, it's fair to say. I think that it's very well realised, despite not being filmed in Scotland at all. It very much, I feel, it feels very like you are in the Scottish Highlands. Maybe it's playing on stereotypes a little bit sometimes, but I feel like that's okay, and it works. And there's some very good sort of Scottish characters. They've actually got Scottish actors in to play proper Scottish characters, and that works really, really well, and just helps you to kind of buy into and believe that we are actually in Scotland when actually they're filming it in West Sussex, which actually is not very far from me. I saw some parts of it were filmed within 20 or 30 minutes drive from where I live, which is quite exciting. But yes, clearly the biggest strength of this story is the Zygons themselves, the shape-shifting alien creatures that we had never seen before in Doctor Who. Probably one of the best and most well-realised costumes for a monster. Sort of taking the idea of not trying to convince you that it's not a man in a suit, but kind of working with that and trying to do that as best they possibly can. Because as soon as you try to go too far away from that, I think it can sometimes just go worse. And you're just like, oh yeah, it's just a man in a ridiculous costume. Whereas with this, it very much, because you can kind of see a bit of the eyes and a bit of the mouth, but there's such all-encompassing costume around them, I'm very much buy into and believe that they are these sort of slightly humanoid-shaped creatures, but very much having a much different exterior ultimately in the Zygons. Just really, really well realised, and the same with the voices as well. When Philip Hinchcliffe was talking about it, saying about how particularly the Vogons in the end of Season 12 and Revenge of the Cybermen had pretty terrible sort of Shakespeare operatic voice type things going on there, or sort of like they're in a massive theatre production trying to do their most posh and like they're doing some Shakespeare. going and moving completely away from that because that's just not very convincing or believable, to these almost whispering tones of the Zygons, which I think, although at points are maybe a little bit difficult to hear or understand exactly what they're saying, I feel like are much more believable as being alien voices than what we've heard in some of the more recent stories. One of the highlights for me has got to be the cliffhangers, particularly the cliffhanger to episode 1 in this story. It's just absolute. Genuinely, I was watching it, it was so genuinely shocking and exciting when you've got Sarah Jane on the phone, telling them that Harry's all right, that everything's okay, and then we kind of are starting to realise that maybe not everything is okay for Harry, and then suddenly we sort of see the arm of this Zygon moving up behind Sarah Jane, tapping her on the shoulder, then pull back to a wide shot of the actual Zygon for the first time in the story, her screaming, the music sort of crescendoing perfectly into the sting at the end of the beginning of the credits. It just was one of the most well created and effective, sort of with all the production elements in place, I think, cliffhanger that I've seen in a long time in Doctor Who, watching the classic series through. I find so often, just one of the little things that so often is difficult is getting the sting and the music right into a cliffhanger. It can feel so kind of rough sometimes when the music just clearly isn't made to be kind of built into a cliffhanger, into the sting. Sometimes the sting can come in way too loud or in the wrong way, or the music beforehand just doesn't work with it. But it felt like it was so perfectly composed from that point of view, and knowing that was going to be the cliffhanger and that's how they were going to cut it, that it just works so cleanly, so effectively. And just the actual action itself of having the first moment of the Zygon being seen is in the final shot of the episode. The classic monster cliffhanger at the end of the first part, it just works so effectively. I think it was one of the absolute highlights of this story. Definitely the extensive amount of location work we see in the story really adds to the kind of the believability of it, I think, more than anything else. We're not stuck in some terrible sets all the way through, where we really are out on location in what's the recreated Scottish Highlands, down on the beach as well, and things like that. It all works so effectively because you've got that real scale of some location filming, which, of course, this features a lot more location filming than was kind of standard for the time, and so it very much was kind of, I think, quite expensive and pushing the boat out a bit there by doing so much of it. But I really just think it benefits the story so much. Now, I mentioned the Scarabs a little bit earlier on, and clearly that's probably the weakest element of this story, is just the poorly realised special effect of the Scarabs, which I think was some sort of like sock puppet that was basically filmed in kind of a stop motion style that was then meant to be put together, because it doesn't look like normal CSO, of course, because it's not done in that way. But unfortunately it is just a little bit of a letdown. I think maybe the initial effect itself would have looked alright on its own, but as soon as you layer it over the film footage, it just really does lose the believability of it. It's not a big deal for me. I've never had a big problem with special effects in Doctor Who generally. Like, I don't really have a problem with the dinosaurs in Invasion of the Dinosaurs, for example, despite them being pretty awful. It's just for classic Who, it's something that I'm always just willing to forgive and look for the stories and the great ideas and concepts behind things they're trying to do, rather than always the realisation, because on a BBC budget in 1975, it just wasn't going to happen. In many ways, this story does kind of use just sort of popular tropes from previous Doctor Who stories, but in a very effective way, because you've got the alien invasion storyline, which is what the Zygons are all about. Our planet's being destroyed, we want to take over the Earth type thing, just because we do. And then the shape-shifting aliens is something we've seen before, something like the Faceless Ones, where sort of the body snatcher idea as well is explored in there. There's just a few, the dodgy CGI as well, or the dodgy special effects is another thing that's added in there. But all the sort of good aspects, I feel like, just all come together to create such an effective Doctor Who story. It's nothing kind of groundbreaking, but it's just something so effective. It's so well put together. It's really sort of one of the sort of most archetypal, stereotypical Doctor Who stories, but in the best possible way. An alien invasion with some interesting concepts behind it, some really dark and horror-esque moments, really, when you've got Sarah chasing the sort of Zygon duplicate of Harry around, Harry seemingly wanting to try and kill Sarah, which is quite a sort of scary moment for children in particular who might not quite understand exactly what's going on. And when you're seeing seemingly the good guy of Harry trying to kill Sarah Jane, that's a really dark and scary moment, and not the sort of thing we would have really seen in maybe the previous era of Doctor Who, I think. So that's something very interesting, and seeing him then running off the top of this sort of barn, the second floor of this barn, and falling to his death, is also a really dark idea as well. So there's just a lot of these different quite dark concepts that are included throughout this story, which I really like. I think is a really good thing for the show, to just sort of have it push the boat out, be a little bit more serious in the vibe of it. The more Hammer horror style stories, I think, are really interesting and effective. But it is very noticeable, the change for this story, I think. I think one of the other really strong settings, which is probably I think as a set rather than any location filming, but the castle where the Duke of Forget is from, is really well realised. And then the sort of shot of moving into the Zygon spaceship as well, as we cut through into there, it's just such an effectively designed. Sort of all the set designs are really strong, I think, in this story. Yes, there's the slightly odd moments where you've got the Zygons rather stroking in an interesting way some of the controls on their sort of spaceship control panel. But I still think it works quite well. I think all the colours and the lighting are so effectively done there to create a very creepy atmosphere and environment. I just think the sets are such another strong aspect of this, combined with the location filming, means visually it's a really strong piece. And then tying up the plot in the end as well with this energy conference that they're sort of targeting basically down in London. And so moving something, the story in episode 4 moves down to London, the spaceship flies off into the sky and moves down to London. We all move down to London for this final few scenes. And the Loch Ness Monster turning up in the River Thames and popping out of there. Yes, it's not the most well realised thing, but just the idea behind it I think is so effective and so fun. And just a great way to end the story, I think, really. And then the final scene of the story I think is a very noticeable kind of moment in what feels like the kind of very final end of the unit era and of the Terrence Dixon Barry Letts era of Doctor Who sort of is saying its final farewell when the Doctor steps off with Sarah, but we say goodbye. Harry decides he's going to stay there. The Brigadier, of course, is going off back home and everything like that. And it very much, I don't know, just for me, it feels like obviously knowing that this is one of the last explorations of UNIT as an organisation within the show, only really getting one more outing, well, for a very long time in the Android Invasion in a couple of stories' time. But then it's very different because you haven't got the Brigadier in that story, among others. It just has a very different vibe to it, I think, and much less of a standard Third Doctor UNIT story. Not that this particularly is, I think it's very much a different use of UNIT and kind of showing how the show has very much changed. It's not the sort of story you could slot into the rest of the UNIT era very effectively because it does feel quite different. But yeah, I think this is kind of the final end of that era of the show, and very much from here on in we're going into the proper Tom Baker, Philip Hinchcliffe era for the next 2 seasons at the very least. So yes, that's my general overall sort of look back at Terror of the Zygons. A very strong story, a great start to season 13, one of the all-time strongest, at least considered by fans, one of the strongest seasons of Who, and certainly one I'm looking forward to getting stuck into the whole of it once again. But yes, guys, I will be back again this time next week, hopefully to look at back at the Planet of Evil, I think it is, or is it the Face of Evil? It is Planet of Evil. I always get mixed up between those two, but of course Face of Evil is in season 14 and Planet of Evil in season 13. I really need to just stop getting confused with that. But guys, do let me know your thoughts on Terror of the Zygons down in the comments below, and I'll be back again next week for a brand new review. But apart from that, as always, hit that like button, that subscribe if you're new here, and I'll see you again very soon for a brand new one. Goodbye.